The Moonfire Kingdom had never known a colder winter, and its people whispered that the chill matched the heart of their king. Alpha King Cade Ashworth stood at the tall window of his study, watching snow fall over the training grounds where his warriors once trained under the summer sun. He was young to hold such power, only 28, yet he carried himself like a man who had already lived 100 lives of duty and loss. His father had died defending the kingdom's borders, and before his final breath, he had given Cade one lesson above all others. A king who loves too deeply becomes a king who can be broken. Cade had taken those words and built a wall around his heart so thick that even his own wolf sometimes howled in protest, trapped behind it. Down in the healer's quarters, Alira Vance ground herbs into a fine powder, her hands steady, even though her heart was not. She had served the kingdom as its healer for 5 years, tending to wounded warriors, easing the pain of the sick, and quietly loving a king who refused to see her. She was not blind to what she was to him. From the very first day she had stepped into the palace halls, she had felt it. The invisible thread pulling her toward him, the way her wolf stirred every time he was near, the warmth that spread through her chest whenever their eyes met by accident. She was his fated mate, she had always known. And so had he. She remembered the night, nearly 2 years ago, when he had first caught her scent shift into something deeper than friendship. He had gone still, his eyes flashing gold for just a moment, before he shuttered them and walked away without a word. From that night forward, he had built distance between them like a fortress, speaking to her only when necessary, never letting his gaze linger, never allowing the bond between them room to breathe. Alira told herself she could wait. She told herself that kings needed time, that walls built from grief take longer to come down than walls built from anything else. She stayed patient through the seasons, through the whispered rumors of alliances and politics, through nights when she cried quietly in her room, and mornings when she rose and served him anyway, because that was who she was, steady, giving, and endlessly hopeful. But hope has a limit, even for a healer who spends her life mending others. The rumor came on a gray afternoon in early winter. Servants spoke of it first in hushed voices near the kitchens, then louder in the halls, until it reached Alira's ears, like a blade sliding quietly between her ribs. King Cad was to be betrothed, not to her, of course, never to her, but to Princess Sable of the Ashgrove Pack, a union meant to strengthen borders and secure peace between 2 powerful territories. The council had already begun drafting the terms. The wedding, they said, would take place before the spring thaw. Alira sat alone in her quarters that night, staring at the small vial of dried moonflower petals she kept on her shelf, a plant known among wolves for its bittersweet meaning, love that blooms in silence and fades without ever being spoken. She had picked those petals the same week she realized what Cade was to her. She had kept them ever since, a quiet reminder of a bond she had never dared to name aloud. She realized, staring at those petals, that she could not stay and watch him marry someone else, while the mate bond inside her slowly hollowed her out. She had seen it happen to other wolves, the way an unclaimed, ignored bond could wear away at a person's spirit until there was nothing left but a shell going through the motions of living. She refused to become that. She loved him too much to let herself disappear like that, and she loved herself enough to choose differently. She decided she would leave, not in anger, not with bitterness, but with the quiet dignity of someone who deserved better than being ignored. The next evening, she asked for an audience with the king. It was granted, as it always was, though the guard who escorted her seemed to sense something different in her posture, something final. Cade sat behind his desk when she entered, papers of trade agreements spread before him, though his eyes lifted the moment her scent reached him, vanilla and dried herbs and something warm that he had never allowed himself to name. He kept his expression carefully unreadable. "Alira," he said, his voice even, "what brings you here?" She stood before him, her hands folded, her chin lifted, despite the way her heart pounded against her ribs. "I came to tell you I'm leaving the kingdom," she said. "I wanted you to hear it from me, not from the servants." Something flickered behind his eyes, gone as quickly as it appeared. "Leaving," he repeated. "Why?" She had rehearsed this moment a dozen times in her mind, yet standing before him now, the words came out simpler than she expected, stripped of anger, full only of quiet honesty. Because I have loved you for 2 years. Cade, because I have felt the bond between us since the day I arrived, and I know you have felt it too. I have waited, hoping you would let yourself feel it as well. But you are to be married soon, and I cannot stay in this kingdom and watch that happen while this bond eats away at everything I am. I deserve more than a life spent loving someone who refuses to see me, so I am leaving, tonight. I only wanted to say goodbye properly, in person, instead of vanishing without a word. The room fell silent except for the crackle of the fireplace. Cade's jaw tightened. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to cross the room, to pull her against his chest, to tell her the truth, that he had felt the bond from the very first moment, that he thought of her more than he thought of his kingdom, that the wall he had built around his heart had never once kept her out, only kept him trapped inside it. But his father's voice echoed louder in his mind. A king who loves too deeply becomes a king who can be broken. He had spent his whole life believing that surviving meant staying closed, and in this moment, faced with the one person who might have proven that belief wrong, he chose the only thing he knew: control. If that is what you wish, he said, his voice flat, distant, cruel in its calmness, then you are free to go. The bond means nothing if one side refuses to honor it. I release you from any obligation to this kingdom. The words landed like stones in Alira's chest. She had hoped, some small foolish part of her had hoped, that saying it aloud might finally break through to him, but his face remained a mask, his eyes cold as the winter outside, and she understood then that hope alone could not build a bridge across a distance someone refused to cross. "Thank you for hearing me," she said quietly, and turned to leave. He did not stop her. He told himself it was strength. He told himself it was wisdom. He watched her walk out of his study and did not move from his chair, even as every fiber of his wolf howled beneath his skin, begging him to follow. She left that same night, slipping quietly through the kingdom's southern gate before the moon reached its highest point. She did not tell anyone where she was going, only that she would not return. Before she left, in a small clearing just beyond the border, she performed something few wolves ever dared attempt: the unbinding rite, an old and painful ritual passed down through generations, used only by those whose mate bond had gone unclaimed and unwanted for too long. It was said to sever the invisible thread between fated mates, freeing both from a connection that caused only suffering. The ritual demanded a piece of the wolf's own spirit as payment, a price Alira paid without hesitation, believing it was the only way she would ever find peace. When it was finished, she felt something inside her go quiet, a silence where a constant pull had once lived. She did not cry, she simply turned and walked into the trees, leaving the Moonfire Kingdom, and Cade, behind her forever. At first, Cade told himself nothing had changed. He returned to his duties, his meetings, his endless correspondence with the Ashgrove Pack regarding the coming marriage. He told himself the empty feeling in his chest was simply exhaustion, that the quiet in the halls was simply the quiet of winter settling over the kingdom. But days passed, and something began to feel wrong. He found himself walking past the healer's quarters more often than necessary, telling himself it was to check on pack members' wellness, though the quarters remained locked and dark. He noticed, faintly at first, that something was missing from the air, a warmth he had never consciously acknowledged until it was gone. He told himself it was nothing. A week passed, then 2. One evening, walking the corridor near the training grounds where Alira used to bring tea to injured warriors, Cade stopped abruptly, his wolf rising sharply within him. He inhaled, searching instinctively for the scent that had lingered there for years: vanilla and dried herbs, and something warm and alive. It was not there, not faded, not distant, simply gone, as though it had never touched that hallway at all. Panic, unfamiliar and unwelcome, began to claw at his chest. He moved quickly through the palace, retracing every place her presence had once lived: the healer's quarters, the herb garden behind the kitchens, the small alcove near the library, where she used to read on quiet afternoons. Nothing. No trace remained. It was as if the kingdom itself had forgotten she ever existed within its walls. Among wolves, there was an old truth passed down through generations, one Cade had heard as a child, but never believed he would face himself. When a mate's scent disappears entirely from a shared territory, it means the bond has been severed completely, either through death or through the ancient rite few dared to perform. A scent does not fade on its own in such absolute silence. It is erased only when the bond that carried it is broken beyond repair. Cade summoned the eldest healer in the kingdom that same night, an elderly woman named Marin, who had trained Alira years before. He asked her directly, his voice raw in a way it had never been before his people. Marin studied him for a long moment before answering. "If her scent has vanished entirely," Marin said gently, "then she performed the unbinding rite before she left. It is the only explanation. It is a rite born of heartbreak, my king, used by wolves who believe their mate will never choose them. Once completed, it cannot be undone. The bond is gone, forever." The words struck Cade harder than any blade ever had in battle. He had spent his whole life building walls to protect himself from vulnerability, believing that control was strength, that silence was wisdom. He realized now, standing in the healer's empty quarters with Marin's words echoing around him, that his silence had not protected him at all. It had cost him the one person in the world who had loved him without condition, who had waited patiently through his coldness, who had finally walked away, not because she stopped loving him, but because she loved herself enough to stop waiting for someone who refused to choose her. He thought of canceling the betrothal that very night, of sending riders in every direction to search for her, of tearing through every territory in the land until he found her. But even as those thoughts surged through him, he understood the terrible truth Marin had confirmed. The bond was gone. Wherever Alira was now, she was no longer tied to him by anything but memory. The rite had freed her completely, and no amount of searching or regret could restore what she had chosen to release. In the weeks that followed, Cade fulfilled his duties as king. He signed the papers for his marriage to Princess Sable, attended council meetings, led his warriors through their winter drills. To his people, he appeared unchanged, strong, composed, every bit the Alpha King they had always known. But those closest to him noticed the way his eyes lingered a moment too long on empty hallways, the way he sometimes stood outside the old healer's quarters, long after nightfall, as though waiting for a door that would never open again. He never spoke Alira's name aloud after that. He never explained to anyone why, on quiet evenings when the palace grew still, he could be found standing at his study window, staring out over the training grounds, his expression unreadable to all but the loneliest parts of himself. The kingdom prospered under his rule in the years that followed. Borders remained secure, alliances held strong, and the people spoke of their king with respect and admiration. But within the walls of his own heart, Cade Ashworth understood a truth he would carry silently for the rest of his life. He had been given a love rare and true, offered freely and patiently, and he had let his fear answer in its place. By the time he finally understood what he had lost, her scent had already vanished from every corner of his kingdom, leaving him powerful, respected, and utterly alone.